Alright everyone, as promised, I need to cover the Patreon situation with Lauren Southern and Patreon's response and everything else under the sun. It's important, and I was going to respond as soon as Lauren Southern was kicked off the platform. But then I figured, well, she's got such a large audience, so many people are so visibly upset, I can't imagine Patreon's going to be able to not respond to this. Lo and behold, Patreon responds, so I'm like, I felt vindicated. And then they respond again a second time, and then I had to sort of wait to see what would happen. Now, Patreon, first let's go through the good things about Patreon as a site, other than being easy to use, which is why I've been using it. They bothered to respond. That's appreciated. I'll get into the response a little more in a minute. Number two, they are implementing an appeals process and a warning process, also good, and hiring more staff. Now, the hiring more staff part, I think it's because they realize now that they've stuck their toes into the political circus that is modern society, they're going to have a lot of people rating one another's page on Patreon simply because they've done this. I think that's the reason why. They're like, well, we're going to get like 10 times more reports because now a lot of people on the left and on the right will be retaliating against one another, trying to undercut one another's fundraising constantly. There's an easy way out for Patreon, and that's to go full libertarian mode. To stop really policing content unless that manifest observable behavior stuff, which is kind of a useless acronym. It just comes off as like college freshman speech mode or something. You should really get rid of that. What's going to happen? People are going to be rating one another. So simply stop policing things unless harm was actually done or a law was actually broken. Not reasonably could be construed as maybe kind of sort of doing so. Not may cause harm. Did cause harm should be your threshold. If you do that, you probably got no more problem. By the way, I hope you're going to let Lauren Southern appeal the decision since she was booted off your site. That's why you're announcing this in the first place. She was booted off. Is this going to be retroactive, or is it going to be like people that got banned on YouTube 10 years ago who can never recover their accounts because there was no appeals process at the time? Because that's I can remember all sorts of during the heavy infighting of 2008. You wouldn't believe how fast they were falling. That was before you could get protected by being a large enough user to be verified. And so you had a significant amount of content. One day, Google just pulls the plug because someone raids you. There was no benefit of being a content creator and having the benefit of the doubt given to you. Basically, if enough people flagged the material, it got taken down. There was no appeal process, really, unless you wanted to write mail physically to Google at the time. It's different now, and it's actually better. But with Patreon, your proposals are all well and good, but you failed at one very important fundamental goal that you yourself stated you had in Jack Conte's video response, which was he said, well, Patreon's not political. This wasn't politically motivated. I'm going to take you through, X, Y, and Z. This is why the account was taken down. There are two reasons why you failed at that. And in all honesty, you need to hear this. Somebody needs to tell you this. The number one way in which you failed was mentioning this other Antifa page at all, because the only reason that has any validity when you're talking about Lauren Southern is because her fans were bringing it up as an example of a far left page that was being allowed to stay up despite encouraging vandalism. And it's a false equivalency. Because Lauren Southern to this day, as far as I know, on none of her content has ever called for any form of violence towards anybody. Never called for violence, never caused for criminal behavior. So far as never, as far as I know, gotten thrown in the brig for criminal behavior or violence. This Antifa page was openly advocating vandalism and sabotage and assault. Those two things don't seem quite the same. So why bother mentioning it? Unless you're assuming that it's equivalent or hoping that you can project that it's equivalent so people will leave you alone. And number two, when you show dead Syrian kid on the beach, I think that's self-explanatory. I'm sure that fans of Lauren Southern, of all people, are going to see that and assume it's not political. That makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate that Patreon responded. And I appreciate the changes that they're making as far as like a warning system. That's all well and good. But you should scale back your TOS entirely. That would be a good suggestion. And number two, because of this, I no longer feel comfortable relying fully on your platform like before, like months ago. I would have said, well, I use Patreon as opposed to AdSense because it's more stable and, basically you're not supposed to harass people and you're not supposed to do violent and evil things and nobody's going to have a problem with your content. Like there was no problem at the time. But now I'm realizing, oh, it might not be a great idea to solely rely on it. Like, I'm going to keep my Patreon up, and I'll tell you why. I have no problem with them. But I am going to be looking for ways for those, you know, almost dozen people messaging me saying, well, I'm no longer using Patreon. I support you, but you need another platform to be on if you know, want a donation from me. Well, then why wouldn't I set up another donation page for people who don't want to use Patreon? Whether it's paypal.me or anything else under the sun. I might end up using that. I did sign up, send in a request to be invited to Patreon, but then the response was actually quite negative, which is funny because their name is totally ironic. It's like a libertarian crowdfunding site. It's like, apparently it's going to be like a libertarian version of Patreon or something. So that doesn't sound bad to me. Yeah, the name's a little bit, you know, it was chosen deliberately, but, you know, whatever. So, I mean, can I fully rely? I mean, right now I don't do activism and I don't harass people or do anything else against Patreon's TOS. But what if you change the TOS on me suddenly? What if you just decide, oh, yeah, we're going to start banning people for edgy political speech? Well, then I'd be screwed. So why would I want to rely solely upon your platform, I guess would be my question. Honestly, you have to understand where other content creators as well are coming from on here. It doesn't just affect Lauren Southern, it affects anybody whose audience loosely overlaps with hers. Mine certainly does. Because of the kind of content being discussed on my channel, disproportionately I have people now that supported both her and myself who now have left your platform. So other people have felt the pain a little bit too. It's not just Lauren Southern who got screwed here. And she did get screwed. You screwed her. Because now you're saying, oh, we'll give people warnings. Well, she didn't get a warning. Personally, I think what you should do is reinstate her right now. Send her an apology. And then just give her a warning and say, okay, well, could you tone down on this one aspect of your content? Let's try to have a negotiation here. And she might say to screw yourself. She might say, well, I'm burning this bridge. She probably would be right to at this point. You've mistreated her and pissed off hundreds of thousands of her fans. But, I mean, you could at least try. Because what you've done now is insert yourself into the political circus of the Western world. Unfortunately, what that means for you is you're going to need a lot of trust and safety staff because people will be raiding one another. That is, people who, and it goes both ways. It both negative for Patreon, by the way. Group of leftists raid some right-wing page. If you don't take it down, they'll call you politically motivated. They'll say, oh, they're only not banning this account because of the Lauren Southern stuff. If you do, they'll say, aha, this is political. See, they're anti-right-wing. If some left-winger gets targeted and they're not taken down, then people on the right will say, aha, they're protecting leftists. But likewise, if you do take them down, people on the left will say, oh, this pro-censorship Patreon. See, you've gotten yourself into a sticky situation from which there is no real extraction. You can help solve the damage by simply changing your TOS so you don't have to police these things. Say, okay, unless it is a crime in the US, or generally agreed upon as a crime in, you know, some other part of the world, it's something that would roughly overlap with US law or something. You're a US firm. You don't have to worry about Italian law. You don't have to worry about Pakistani law or Russian law or anything like that. Change your TOS so that it has to have been criminal or have caused harm. Those should be the only things, or it's like slanderous or open harassment, stalking stuff. Other than that, don't police other stuff. Saying edgy, offensive things should be perfectly allowed for fundraising purposes. Who cares? You know, you might worry about the PR fallout. Look at the PR fallout for banning Lauren Southern from your site. It's just not a great idea. And if Patreon doesn't do well, then it also kind of screws me because I use your service. So I'm trying to give you advice in good faith here, now that maybe you'll actually see this video. You obviously pay attention to large content creators when they're miffed at your platform. Well, pay attention to me. I'm trying to give you advice here. Strip back your TOS. Simple as that. Then no problem. Because everyone will feel comfy using your site. And it means less work for you. Less overhead. You might not even need those extra staff you're considering hiring. Wonderful. 3 cheers for Patreon. You've just saved your own site from having to deal with these situations. I would think it's something to think about. Again, regardless of your, let's say, kind of obvious political bias. You do have a bias. I have a bias. Lauren Southern has a bias. Jack Conte has a bias. Everybody has a bias. Trying to say, no, we don't, trust us. Nobody here at Patreon possibly be biased in their decision-making. That's just, you're claiming to be androids then. You're human beings. Of course that influences your decision making. It does everybody's decision making. I'm looking for a co-host. Do you think that my political views don't have something to, like I'm just going on their speaking ability and whether I find them funny? No, it has a little bit to do with political and religious views. Just an eensy bit. There's a little bit of bias there as far as what I'm going to do with the future of my channel. It's self-explanatory. That's about all. Peace out.